my guest this week has been involved in the business of professional wrestling his entire life. And I mean that. I mean, indirectly, he was helping to sell tickets for wrestling at the age of 3. He is also one of the true innovators of the entertainment and showmanship that has become so much a part of professional wrestling all the way till today, as well as a great ambassador for the industry over the years. Welcome, Jerry Jarrett. Jerry, thank you. Jerry, thank you for coming on to Primetime with Sean Mooney.
Yes, well, I'm flattered that you asked me, Sean. I said before we started the show, we've just missed each other's careers, intersecting a number of times. I got to WWE probably 6 months after you left.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing, and I was very close. I left in '93. You came to at least work in Connecticut. I know you'd been in touch with Vince over the years before that, but you actually were in Connecticut, and we'll get into that. But I wanted to really kind of go back and trace your career because, like I said, it's been a part of your life. I mean, since you were a very, very small child. So you've really not known anything else in your life.
Well, that's partially true. Yeah. I was promoting wrestling while I was in high school. Yeah. But then I went to college and had a little sabbatical from it. And then when I graduated, I made bicycles for Murray, Ohio Manufacturing Company for about 4 years.
Yeah. And I know there's a lesson in there too, because I think that could have been something that, you could have done your entire life. I think you were offered a vice presidency and you decided that wasn't what you wanted to do, but it's amazing how fate steps in. But you even knew then that you wanted to control your own destiny. I guess that's the best way to say it.
Yeah. I told Bill Hannon, who was the president, and he had just demoted all of the executives that his daddy put in place. Yeah. And I said, Bill, I'm not made emotionally to when your son takes over to be put out to pasture. So I don't know what I'm going to do. I may end up selling pencils on 4th and Church, but I'm going to find something else to do. And he thought I was crazy, because it offered the position I was offered, director of purchasing, at 26 years old was something most people wouldn't have turned down.
Well, but I think you had a little more confidence in yourself that you would not end up selling pencils. I mean, given the fact that you were promoting wrestling events at 14, and that, to me, is pretty amazing. Did you just have an understanding of the business early on?
No, I really didn't. I was a big fan, but right. They called me in and said, now that you've got your driver's license, it was a hardship license, why don't you run some of the spot shows? And I said, what do you mean run them? And he said, promote them. Mm-hmm. All you have to do is go put out window cards and sell tickets and rent a building and you're in business. Mm-hmm. So I really, and literally, that's how simple it was. I didn't do any of the booking or any of the matchmaking. As a matter of fact, I wasn't smart to the business. Yeah. But I was smart enough to know that if you bought the sports editor of the newspaper in the little country town a lunch, he'd give you a good write-up.
Well, you understood promotions. You may not have understood the business, but man, not a lot of people at 14 and a little older than that would have that understanding that that's what it's all about.
Yes. I was fortunate.
Yeah. Still humble after all these years. You talked about, you said at 14, you weren't smart to the business. And, listening to an interview, one of the interviews you've done, and you mentioned how heartbroken you were when you found out what the real business of wrestling was. But it really got me thinking about it. first of all, tell us that about that. The fact that I guess you put it, when you believe in something and love something so much, you just think it's got to be that way.
Yes, and I cried when my mother smartened me up about Santa Claus. But I didn't want to know that she was Santa Claus. And, I don't know, if 8 or 10 or 12 years old, I was a believer a long time. But, I love, I loved the romantic poets when I was in school. And it's kind of a romantic life to look forward to the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and then the reality of life that very little in it is real. Yeah, to me, it's a downer.
Yeah.
So, I was riding in the back seat of one of the cars to go check up in some town that Nick Goulas and Roy Welch were running, and I kind of dozed off. But then when I woke up, they were talking about the business and talking about high spots and, how stupid the promoters were. And let's have the match and get it over with and get out of this SHIT hole. And, I loved the small towns. I thought that they had character and atmosphere, but no Santa Claus and no wrestling shoots.
Yeah, and I think you said that when you told the promoter, they actually sent one of the guys away to say, "Hey, gee, I'm so glad that you told us that he was giving up matches. He was." He was throwing matches.
Yeah, I would come back and Roy Welch would call me in the office and say, "Okay, give me a report. How were the matches?" And I said, "Well, the main event was real good, but I believe those two guys in the first match were faking it." And he said, "Boy, I will have a talk with them." And, they didn't see any need to smarten me up. I was counting the tickets and bringing the money home.
Yeah, well, kayfabe was very, very strong back then. But, it got me thinking, though, and I don't know if you've ever done any research or have had people tell you how this business all happened. It's based on carnival. It's theater in a lot of ways. But it's also, there's the athleticism in it. And a lot of amateur wrestlers became professional wrestlers because that was a way for them to make money after they had their wrestling career end. But I've often wondered why it became a work. Because we have the MMA today, and you wonder if back then maybe they could have made amateur wrestling a shoot. Have you ever given that some thought?
Yeah, and my youngest son was a very good amateur wrestler in high school, and I just absolutely loved it. Yeah. And all the years that I promoted, I liked the guys that were known as shooters, Ali Basari and Billy Robertson and Lou Thez. I really admired them. But if you will watch the Olympics, that's the height of amateur wrestling. Yeah. And sometimes the stadium is a third full. Yeah. I would go to, my son played football, and you'd have to get there early to get a seat in the stadium. But you could go to the wrestling meets, and you could have a dove hunt and not shoot anybody. I mean, just nobody came.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's the roots of it.
Yeah. I think you're right.
What propelled it was that the promoters, when most of the people in the business were shooters, and the promoter would try to get one of them to take a fall or put his opponent over.
Right.
If they didn't want to, they would just tell the promoter to go to hell, and he couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So oftentimes the lesser wrestler would be the one with charisma and could draw the house. So the promoters, and me at 76, and I cut my teeth under Roy Welch, who would be over 100, I guess, if he were alive today.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to him often about it, and he said that Carl Gotch was one of the reasons that the promoters started leaning to the workers rather than the shooters.
Yeah.
It makes sense that the promoters would want somebody that they could handle, or not handle, influence. Yeah. And so I took the opposite approach during my wrestling promotion career, and I tried to allow the fans to suspend disbelief and make it as real as it could be without hurting each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the brawls and the action in and out of the ring and all the crazy stuff we did in the Tennessee territory, at least it looked real. Yeah. People got angry when they found out the concession stand brawl in Tupelo, Mississippi was not real. Bill Watts got really angry at me when he found out that Jerry Lawler really didn't hurt. Clay, the movie star Taxi.
Oh, Andy Kaufman. Yeah, really? Bill Watts?
Oh, yeah. He called me to thank me for protecting the business and having Lawler beat the hell out of Andy Kaufman and send him to the hospital.
Yeah, he spent a couple of days in the hospital. He really consoled him.
Yeah, but Andy was a believer in kayfabe.
Yeah.
And so he went, he wore that neck brace around Hollywood for a month.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, that was funny. Bill Watts saw the little clip on national television and he just knew it was real.
Yeah. Oh, God, if they pulled it over with him, man, that's saying something.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're right, though. I mean, it's all about storylines and people, and I knew even back in the day when in the 80s that most of the people, the vast majority of people that are in that arena know that what it is, but they want to believe and they want to go for the ride. And it's all about storytelling. It's all about the drama and building these storylines. And I think that maybe, today, and it's another discussion, we've lost some of that. But that back in those days where you could go months and months, and when you had the territories and you had these guys that would come in and you might have an 8-month run and then the guy would disappear, and then you'd bring him back. And, that was just storytelling at its best back in those times.
Yes, that was, I call it the glory days of wrestling. Yeah. Because when a wrestler would come in to the territory to work for us,
yeah,
I told him, I would tell them, I would sit them down and I would say, when you go to the Rocky movie,
yeah,
and see the fight scene, wouldn't you really be upset because you're emotionally into it? And when I saw the movie when it first came out, everybody in the theater stood up and applauded when Rocky made his big comeback.
Yeah.
And I would tell them, if you do something that exposes the business in the ring, it's the same thing as if you took a wide shot during the Rocky movie, the fight scene.
Yeah.
And saw the cameras and the directors and the lighting people all around the ring, and some guy sitting in the back hollering, "Retake, let's shoot that over."
Yeah.
You'd be terribly angry. Let's let the people that have paid their $5 for our ticket prices then, let's let them get their money's worth. And it doesn't matter if logic prevails at the water cooler the next day.
Yeah.
What matters is that while they are there, they can suspend their disbelief.
Yeah. They get away from everything and they go for the ride. I mean, it's true.
Yes.
And so thank goodness that you decided not to sell bicycles, because it brought you back to the business. And all this time, I guess you were, when you got back in, acquiring knowledge to the point where you were still pretty young when you started the CWA, the Continental Wrestling Association. And how did that, though, all come about where you went into business?
Well, I worked for Nick Goulas and Roy Welch to start out with.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And my mother started out as a ticket seller on Tuesday night at the Hippodrome. Mm-hmm. But she was a sharp lady and ended up being the bookkeeper for the wrestling office. Mm-hmm. So when I came into it, I had a pretty much open door policy or chance to promote. Mm-hmm. My mother objected as strong as you can object. She threatened to quit if they let me start wrestling. And she lined it up with an old shooter named Sailor Moran to beat me up for 3 months to dissuade me from getting in the wrestling business. Mm-hmm. But I had Tojo whispering in my ear and saying, "You can take it. The real business is not like that, Jerry." So Tojo was teaching me the work and Sailor was beating me up. And it went from there to finally Sailor probably lied to my mother, and told her, "Well, you don't have to worry about anybody roughing Jerry up. He can take care of himself." I think Sailor really felt sorry for me because he put me over a lot more than I deserved. But then, I had my opportunity to book, and I just started out. I brought back my heroes, Don and Al Green and Jackie Fargo, and teamed with Tojo and turned him babyface. And it seemed like everything we did in the early days worked. And we ended up going from Ellis Auditorium, a small building downtown Memphis, to the Mid-South Coliseum that seats 10,400. Yeah. And we had a phenomenal 20-year run.
Yeah. Pretty amazing. And getting into the ring, though, I mean, was that something, I think originally you did it because you're going to get some extra money to do it. But was it something, though, that you wanted to do, knowing and loving the business, or did it just kind of happen, like I said, for a few extra bucks, and maybe you thought you'd learn a little bit more about the business?
No, Tojo encouraged me. Back in those days, they paid the referee $5, $10, or a big house, they gave him $15. Uh-huh. And the opening match would make $40 or $50. And so it just made sense that if I'm going to make the 300-mile trip, it's a lot better to make $40 or $50 than it is $10 or $15. And of course, then, when things started clicking, my involvement in the ring helped propel me as a promoter.
Right.
And, I quit wrestling as soon as I could. Celebrity, some people live off of it. Jerry Lawler, Bill Dundee, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, they all thrive on celebrity. It was always, from the very beginning, a big nuisance to me because I think I'm basically an introverted person.
Mm-hmm.
And so as soon as I felt like I had the talent, I quit, for me just to promote, that's what I did.
Yeah. But were you doing it, though, at the same time? Were you still involved?
Oh, yeah. I was wrestling the whole time.
Wow. And but did you enjoy, besides you said the fame part of it was something that you could have cared less about. But what about actually being in the ring? And I know that you always considered yourself not a big man, but you was that something though that you did that you look back on and you really look back at it fondly?
Yeah, I loved it because being small, I could sell and really get the crowd worked up. And of course, the goal of the promoter is to accomplish that. So I could assist in my own end. And so I spent a career making the heels look very, very, very mean and callous. And, but, I would see older guys wrestle and I would think, I hate it that they have to go to this length to make a living. And so as soon as I didn't think I was a cute little guy again, a boy toy, I certainly quit.
Yeah, that could take its toll for sure. You mentioned Jerry Lawler. I know he's somebody that was involved in your life. I mean, forever. I mean, it seems like from very early on. How did that relationship first begin? Because he wasn't. I think when you met him, he wasn't a wrestler at the time.
No, he was a kid, and he drew banners. He was a talented artist. Yeah, and he worked for Jackie Fargo at a radio station there in Memphis. And so Jackie asked me one day, would I allow him to show some of his art, pictures of the wrestlers that he'd drawn? And I said, sure. And then he did that, and then lo and behold, 2 or 3 months later, Jackie came to me and he said, will you give him a tryout on TV? And I said, sure again. And from Jerry's first match, you could see that he was very, very talented and had charisma with
had that presence. Yeah.
So, the story went from there. He, I promoted him as our number one guy, and he carried the ball well.
Yeah. Well, he had certainly has had quite a career. You mentioned working with Nick Gulas and Roy Welch, and that was a union for quite a bit of time. And then I think was it Welch? I don't know if he became ill or he got out of the business, and that allowed you to get a piece of it. How did that all happen? Because I wanted to build up to the point to where you got your own promotion for the first time, and I knew Lawler was involved in that. But prior to that, what was your business dealings?
I'll try to make it very, very brief. Roy Welch would talk to me about what I thought of the matches and what I would do next week, because he'd give me a ride, and that 3.5 hour ride to Memphis, sometime 4 hours, gave us a lot of talking time. Yeah. So he liked my ideas and let me start booking. So I built a pretty good reputation, and Jim Barnett flew from Australia to Hendersonville, and the proverbial made me an offer I couldn't refuse. He said, if you'll come to Atlanta, I bought it. We're in a war with the Gunkles. and the only way I can win that war is to outdraw her at the box office. And he said, do you think your Memphis formula will work? I said, well, Mr. Barnett, it'll work anywhere.
Yeah.
And but I don't want to go anywhere. I'm at home and I'm making a good living. And he said, my boy, I will pay you whatever you want. Well, how do you turn that down?
Yeah.
So I said, well, what I want is $500 a day.
A day then? Wow.
A day. And he said, no problem.
Wow.
If you don't draw me sellouts, I will fire you. And I said, well, you know, I'm going to make several $1,000s just while he gets back from Australia.
Yeah. Whatever happens, yeah.
But everything worked. Luthez helped me. He allowed Terry Garvin, who played the effeminate role, to slap him in the ring. And, you know, everybody helped. Johnny Walker busted his butt when I dressed him up as wrestling too. Everything worked. And we were able to pack the city auditorium consistently. And I went to Jim and I said, why don't we go to the Omni? We can't get all the people in. So that's where wrestling started, at the Omni.
Wow. That's amazing. And you mentioned Australia, and it's kind of a sidetrack here, but a lot of people don't realize how big, I guess you'd call it a territory. It was a vast territory that, you know, a lot of that was like a part of, you know, a wrestler's travels that Barnett really had quite a business going on over there.
Oh, yeah, very good. But he just, you know, Jim is the kind of guy that likes the bright lights of New York or Las Vegas more than he does the outback of Australia. So he wanted to get back here, and Lester Welch wanted to, for sure, get away from Ann Guckle. So that opened him up an opportunity to buy the territory at a very, very cheap price.
So you made a lot of money though, and it sounds like it went really well. But what brought you back home?
Oh, I've got off my story.
Yeah. Well, if you have more to say about the Australia,
no. I mean, I got off with my other story to your first question.
Yeah. Yeah, I do that a lot. I get off the track, so.
how I got a percentage. Nick and Roy called and said, if you'll come back home, we will give you 10% of the whole territory. And so I knew that I didn't know what it was drawing right then, but I knew when I left, 10% would be a lot more than $500 a day that I was making for Barnett.
Wow.
So I gave Jim my notice, and he and I remained friends till his death. But I went back, and then Roy got sick, and Nick offered to sell me an additional 40%, you know, where I'd have Roy's interest, for $50,000. And so, you know, that's a lot of money back in that day, but I had made a lot of money. So I made the deal. It turned out that I thought I was buying 50%. I was really just buying an option on the 40%. And so that led to our breakup.
Yeah.
Me and Nick Goulas, and you know, the Lord works in mysterious ways. I went home and cried, thinking my world had come to an end when he and I had our falling out. I mean, literally cried.
Yeah. Why would he do that, though? I mean, after you'd been around him,
he loved his son too much. His son was not particularly gifted as an athlete, and George wanted to come to Memphis where all the sellouts were happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wasn't going to have it because I knew what would happen. And so anyway,
yeah, but
split.
he screwed you in that deal, though. I mean, wasn't it written up where, I mean, that wasn't a fair deal. So it looked like something that he had planned.
He and his lawyer, because of my naivety, he and his lawyer set it up where I was buying an option. And you know, I was naive. I read the contract, but you know how all the fine print and you skim over it, and I trusted.
Yeah, I mean, you've been with him for years and years and years.
Yes, and anyway, it really turned out to be the blessing of my life.
Yeah,
because it gave me a chance to go in business for myself and accumulate some wealth.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And then, and we mentioned with the CWA. And so how did that form? Because I know that Lawler would be involved. I know your mom was still a big part of it. You know, how did that all come together that you were able to, you know, put that deal together and put together a very, very successful promotion?
Well,
this is 1977, right?
Yes. When I broke away from Nick, I needed to give Lawler an incentive because I had everything built around him. So I gave him 10%. From the time I opened up Louisville, Evansville, and Lexington, Kentucky, I gave my mother 25% of that, of each town, the promotion. So it ended up Jerry had 10% of the whole territory. My mother had 25% of 3 towns. The 3 of the major towns, except she didn't have any part of Memphis. And, you know, it stayed that way.
Yeah. But, Jerry, what do you think it was, though, about the way you, I guess, booked or put these promotions together? Because there's a lot of, you know, back then, there were a lot of promotions that didn't go anywhere. And I know that, you know, Bill Watts struggled at times. The Von Erichs had, you know, I think they eventually went bankrupt. What was it you think that you were able to put together such successful promotions?
You know, since I've been away from the business, I've had time to reflect.
Yeah.
If you had asked me that 30 years ago, I would have said, I don't know. I had some basic beliefs. And so when a wrestler would come in, I would have the talk about allow the fans to suspend disbelief. If you only know how to do an arm drag or a wrist lock, then just do that. Don't think you have to make 100 moves. And then, you know, I know you watch television and but all these acrobatic things that you see, they expose the business. So I think that was a principle that really, really made us different. The other thing was I would set everybody down and I would say, now I'm not preaching to you, but I want you to just think about this. Your fingerprint that God stamped on you from the instant you were conceived is the only fingerprint exactly like it in the entire world, not just the United States, in the entire world. You're a very unique person. And if you try to be gorgeous, I told Terry Garvin this. I said, I love it that you want to do the flamboyant gimmick. And I will help you and I'll push you. But the first time you try to act like Gorgeous George instead of Terry Garvin, it'll be over. because you won't draw any money. I told Jim Cornette, Jim, don't try to be like Bobby Heenan. You are unique unto yourself. Yeah. So everybody that worked for me, I was tutoring them to be themselves and to be realistic. And I think compelling storylines and putting these unique individuals, I wish Vince would see that, he's having trouble getting somebody with charisma out of his current stable. Well, a guy sitting down memorizing a script doesn't have any chance of projecting his uniqueness that God gave him, his personality, and therefore project and be a charismatic character. It's like they're rubber stamped, and that just won't work.
Yeah. Well, and you said the word unique. You got to be unique, and you got to be true to yourself with that. And we've seen that over and over again. When people find that, that's when that magic happens. And we'll talk about some of those stars. But I think also that was great about the way you looked at the business is it was, the old school where, they would, like you said, they go in there and the storylines were stale and they would just keep redoing them and they would say, let's do this one. You're always looking at something different. And, for example, with, presentations, you were among the first that used music, which today people go, what? But nobody used music on entrances or lights or, flashing lights and that kind of thing. Were you always looking for different things to try to see how audience would react to it? Was that, you used faster guys that, young guys that weren't these giant, behemoths, quick moving in the ring. It was something that people weren't used to seeing. Were you always kind of looking for something different?
Oh, absolutely. My attention span is not very long. And so I would sit and watch a match, and if I got bored with it myself, I assumed that the fans were not really into it. So I would adapt, and I would tell the wrestlers, move, speed it up. Now, the Rock and Roll Express took to it 100%. Yeah. Billy Robertson didn't take to it 100%. And I really liked Billy and loved his work and his shoot ability. Yeah. But I could never get Billy to speed it up a notch. Yeah. And Billy would say that it's his size. And then along comes Bam Bam Bigelow that's bigger than Billy Robertson. Yeah. And Bam Bam could go 90 miles an hour. Right. So, we wanted a faster pace. We wanted the people to be individualistic. I watched my children, who were fascinated to the point of getting in trouble with me not coming to dinner, with MTV. Mm-hmm. And so I just tried to copy the fast-paced clips that were MTV in the early days. So
do you feel that you always had that ability to read what your audience wanted? In a sense, with the psychology of it, like you said, you could watch a match and go, I don't think they're going to like this, or, having the understanding that when you'd have, you went after younger talent who would be these good-looking guys, heartthrobs, but you also wanted them to be masculine because you wanted the girls to bring their boyfriends. And, right. And so did you feel like you kind of always had that gift, I guess was what you'd call it?
Well, we're getting into my spirituality. Yes, I think God gives everybody certain talents. And I can't sing Happy Birthday and stay in tune. If we're having a birthday party, my wife will nudge me to not sing very loud. But a lot of it, Sean, is just common sense. I knew that I was not really the boss in the wrestling business. I knew that the fans that bought the tickets were the boss. And so I would sit in the back of the Louisville Gardens or the Mid-South Coliseum or the Evansville Coliseum, Rupp Arena. It was wonderful because I could sit up and the fans didn't even know I was there. Mm-hmm. And I would listen to them, and they would tell me which wrestlers they hated and wanted to get beat up and which wrestlers they loved and felt sorry for. And boy, if you watch the matches and don't listen to them, you're soon to be out of business. I had a little pilot of Olympus Wrestling, and it was up in not far from Philadelphia, so we had a lot of ECW fans. And they started chanting, "You missed a high spot, you missed a high spot, you suck, that's a phony punch." And so I went to the wrestlers afterwards and I said, "Why didn't you just pick up a chair and one of you bust the other one over the head?" Yeah. They were telling you that your match was phony and not real. So, you know, it's that philosophy. I love amateur wrestling because it's real, and I love professional wrestling when it looks real.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about, you say it's common sense though, but if everybody could do it, they would have been successful in the business. And you saw them come and go. And before we talk more about the WWF, the WWE, there was this vast the land of territories that were across the United States, Canada, other places around the world that people respected it, and NWA was a big part of this alliance. But was that really a great time for wrestling, or was it inevitable that it would become what it did with what we see today as the WWE, and then we've got other independents and some that are emerging? But was that, in your mind, the greatest period of time, or not?
No, I think. Yes, I think during that run, wrestling was as hot and had such appeal that it's never had since. Yeah. But I felt like, I dropped out of the NWA. And the reason I left is I would talk to Fritz von Erich, and I'd talk to Jim Crockett Sr., and I talked to Vince McMahon Sr. And, Tunney up in Canada and Roy Shire out on the West Coast, I'd talk to all of them, and I would say, I am the baby in this business. And I don't want for all of y'all to be gone and me being the last man standing. Why don't you bring people in that are younger and teach them, share your wisdom and knowledge with them? Yeah. And they swatted me off like a fly.
Yeah.
And so what happened was, the best way to sum it up, there was a bunch of us going to try to compete with Vince. Eddie Einhorn was behind it. So we met.
The baseball.
Yes.
Yeah. Owner.
And he had some capital, so we met up in Chicago. And Vince McMahon heard about the meeting, and he called Eddie. And Eddie asked us, should I take his call? And yes. So he came back and he said, Vince McMahon was just giving me some friendly advice. And he said I was wasting my time. He said, the people in that room all think they are the smartest people in the world. And you won't be able to get a census if you try to order pizza for lunch. And you know what? He was 100% right.
Yeah.
This group, they chose to let me produce the TV in Memphis and Louisville, and we put it on in New York for 8 weeks, and we ran a show in the Meadowlands that was just short of a complete sellout.
Mm.
And that night, Bill Watts called me before the event and said, I hear it's almost a sellout. And I said, yeah, it is, Bill. He said, well, I'm pulling out of the group.
Mm.
I want to do my own thing.
Yeah.
And Jim Crockett Jr. came to me at the event and said, do whatever you want to, but I'm leaving.
Mm.
And then Vern Gagne was in charge of the box office, and he took the money, and nobody ever saw a penny of it.
Yeah. So in a sense, their egos did them in. And did you know then that this was the demise of the territories?
Yes. I knew that it was coming to an end.
Wow. And I know you had great respect for Vince Sr. And
Yes.
But you developed quite a relationship with Vince McMahon Jr. That lasted for many years, and I know you were really close. So how did that relationship develop? And I'm assuming it was not too far off from that time.
Yeah, Vince Sr. called me one night. I mean, we had a lot of conversations, but usually it was about business. But he called me one night, and he never called at night. He called during the daytime in my office.
Mm-hmm.
And he called me late one night, and he said, Jerry, every conversation we have, you say, if there's anything I can do for you, Vince, to repay you, because Vince and Eddie Graham are the two that talked the alliance into letting me have an NWA membership, and they never do that before.
Wow.
You know, they protected the old guard, but they let me be the NWA representative, and then after that they asked, do you care if Nick Goulas is also an NWA? I said, not at all.
Mm.
You know, the best promotion will survive. So Vince Sr., I felt I owed him beyond our friendship.
Yeah.
And so I would say, Vince, if there's anything I can do, you're in New York, you've got the talent in the big towns, but if you ever just need freshening up or some job men or anything, please tell me. So then he calls me that night and he says, Jerry, I am very, very sick, and I won't be around long.
Mm.
And he said, my boy wants to own the world.
Huh.
And he wants to take this territory and expand it all over the U.S. and then all over the world.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't know if he will make it or not. But he said, the thing that I do know is there'll come in his life when he desperately needs a real friend.
Huh.
And I said, Vince, I can't foresee him ever calling me. But if he does, I'll be there.
Huh.
And Vince, he died within a couple of weeks of that call. So that was in the back of my mind, and I meant it when I said it, but I never in 100 years thought Vince would call. And one Sunday, he called, and he said, I just need somebody to talk to, Jerry. It's hard for me to talk to the people that work for me. And the conversations were so long and so intense, of a personal nature. He would tell me everything about his life, and I'd tell him everything about mine. And so much so that my wife, when we go to a dinner party, somebody would say, what are you doing Friday? And she'd go, well, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Vince Day. Monday, wow. Tuesday. And they would laugh and say, what is Vince Day? Oh, Jerry spends 4 hours talking to this promoter in New York. And
what year was this, Jerry? I just want to get a perspective of where Vince was on his journey.
I'm going to guess it was your last year, 93.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Wow. And Vince...
Those were troubled times.
Oh, yeah, Vince, and he was under terrific pressure.
Yeah.
And so we would talk about, Pat Patterson has his problems. Mm-hmm. And so Vince had to let him go home because of some referee accusation. I don't know if it's true or not. Never asked Pat about it. Mm-hmm. But then he had 3 women that had lawsuits about sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. Then he had the press in New York that was just absolutely vicious. And between the bad press and the stress on Vince, the territory was at an all-time low. Mm-hmm. And finally he said, I know I'm asking a lot because I've been your competitor, but I have some great people. Pat Patterson's a great finish man. J.J. Dillon is great at talent relations. I've got the best treasurer. Everything is working. But if I have to, and Linda is the glue that holds this company together. Yeah. But Linda doesn't know anything about the wrestling business, Jerry. The booking, the day-to-day creative part. But I don't have anybody that if I have to go to jail can hold it all together. Would you consider coming up and just taking a look at it? And I said, Vince, if you would come to see me here in Tennessee, I live in a huge house in the middle of 107 acres. I've got horses, chickens. I've got 100 head of cattle. And then I'm making a pretty good living. And he said, well, I understand it if you can. And that Sunday conversation ended, and then my memory jolted me of Vince Sr. and my promise. So I picked up the phone and called him back, and I said, yeah, send me a plane ticket and I'll come up and look. So, that was the start of it.
He was, in a sense, asking you to run the business if he was going to go to prison.
Yeah. Well, he had a big meeting. Oh. I think J.J. Dillon's the only one I know that's talked about it. Oh. I saw a podcast or read it in the book or something. Oh. Vince had a meeting in the cafeteria and had all the chairs set up, and he had a big table up at the head and just 3 chairs, and Vince was in the one on the right, and he motioned me to sit down in the middle, and Linda was on the other side. And he told the people, if Jerry comes in your office, it's the same thing as me walking in. Then he told him a little bit about my background, and he said, we never know what tomorrow's going to bring. And that was the end of the meeting. I didn't understand. He made a big deal out of just a 5-minute conversation. I didn't talk. And but anyway, I really like Vince. I think Linda is one of the smartest women. I have her on a level with my mother as far as intelligence.
Yeah, she really is one smart lady, that's for sure.
Yeah, and so anyway, I prayed that he would get exonerated. Jerry McDivitt, the attorney, said, no, you can't beat the government. We're going to fight as hard as we can, but get ready. You're going to have a lot on your shoulders. Yeah. So I prayed, and then when Vince walked out on those steps, it was on television, we were all glued to it, and they said he was exonerated. I started crying, and I went to my apartment there in Stanford and gave my furniture to the concierge guy, and I grabbed a few personal things and put them in my car and said, I love you, Vince, but I'm going home.
What about that time, though, you did spend up there with Pat and Bruce and the triumvirate, as I used to kind of refer to it. What was that experience like?
The what?
To be around Bruce, Pat, and Vince, and you know, at the house in Greenwich. That was where they did things. And what was that experience like to be a part of that for that brief period of time?
Well, Vince would do all of his creative work in his dining room table. And Pat and Bruce and I would come, and I really did not participate very much in the creative because I was trying to learn. You know, they have the merchandise building, the warehouse is huge.
Yeah.
I had to get a crash course on how that worked. The TV station, the studios, the finances, the treasurer, the booking of the buildings and the arenas, the scheduling, J.J. Dillon's interaction with all the talent. Yeah. It was, you know, my plate was more than full, and sometime I'd show up and be kind of rum-dum. But anyway, Vince is the boss. Yeah. And he'll ask for suggestions, but he really don't want any. And so, you know, the things that I felt that were critical, I would talk to him about. He had the Lex Express campaign going when I first got there, and nobody would show up. And so, you know, I expressed myself. I said, Vince, Lex is a great guy. Looks like $1 million, but he lacks the charisma to carry the banner for the WWF. Who would you use? Well, I know you're not going to like this, but you have had giants, and giants I love. I love Andre the Giant. I love Plowboy Frazier that we have. I like big men, but if I were going to name somebody, I'd take Bret Hart. He's got a great presence. Well, Vince went along with it. I loved to watch personally Sean and Marty Jannetty. And so I suggested that he put the tag belts on two little shrimps, as he called them, in Madison Square Garden. And I'm sure to this day it's the biggest pop the Garden ever had. So if anybody wants to go back and trace history, the introduction of smaller talent went from 1994 forward.
Yeah. Well, and Brett, that was a great decision too. That was a great time for the business of them trying to come back and succeeding eventually. But he came at a time when they definitely needed him, and it was a great decision at the time.
Yeah,
people want to check the numbers. I mean, it's the way it went.
Compare Sean to, and I love Scott Hall. I mean, he and I are really close to this day. Uh-huh. But Sean is like a shrimp compared to Scott Hall and
Kevin Nash and all those big.
Kevin Nash, yeah. Okay. I mean, they had the deal where Kevin Nash was Sean's bodyguard.
Yeah. Yep.
And that showed the contrast in size. So I think that that's an area I had creative influence. Most of my influence was business related.
Yeah, but I'm sure you thought it was a blessing when Vince did get exonerated and you didn't have to take over.
I was drinking 3 or 4 bottles of wine at night, every night.
But I've kept you a while, but you've really had these close encounters, I guess we go with the superstars that have gone on to in the stratosphere of the history of professional wrestling. But you saw many of them before anybody even knew their names. And one that certainly stands out. You saw Dwayne Johnson, who eventually, of course, we know became the mega star he is now, The Rock. But back then, you saw him when he was Rocky Johnson's kid.
Yeah, Rocky and I were really, really close.
Yeah,
he was my first black champion, and Rocky and I still talk to this day. He's a wonderful human being, and you can tell somebody that has had the financial success of Dwayne Johnson and is still humble, and you never hear anything ugly about him. You know that his parents did a lot of parenting. And Rocky and Peter's wife Peter's daughter, did a incredible job.
Yeah, and we mentioned before about finding and becoming your own unique person. That was always in Dwayne, and it was when he found it, and when he trusted it, when he became this incredible star in the ring.
Well, and the same is true with Sting and Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan and Jerry Lawler and all of them. My contribution was not in making them superstars, but in making them believe in themselves and to portray themselves. So I think that's one of the big secrets of the business.
Well, and another one, and you someone like Hulk Hogan, who you saw early on, and you made a statement that at the time when you saw him, he hadn't decided that he was a professional wrestler, I think as you put it, but I think it's more that he hadn't found himself and who he was in the charisma and recognized what he had to be that unique person who certainly has got to be among the absolute biggest personalities in the history of professional wrestling.
Yes. Louis Tillett called me one day and he said, I've got a big blonde bass player in a band. And he said, Louis was trying to flatter me. He said, you can turn this raw piece of clay into a superstar. if you'll just try. I said, well, where is he in his training? He said he has difficulty walking and chewing bubble gum at the same time. I said, oh, Louis, what do you... No, just let him come up there if you have to send him right back to Florida. So my wife and I were in the kitchen, and you could see the street in front of our house, and he pulled out and uncoiled out of that car the giant that he was, and long blonde hair. And I said, well, Louis was right. I'm going to try to do something. And I took him. He really was uncoordinated, couldn't wrestle at all. I took it on myself to take him to Tupelo, Mississippi, where my father-in-law had a ring set up permanently. And, you know, he's so big, and I'm relatively small. I was probably 220 at the time. And then I thought he's going to kill me. We figured out the big leg drop that he used his whole career. Well, believe it or not, to not hurt your opponent takes a lot of timing of where your butt lands and where your leg lands and where the face is in the crook where the knee bends.
Yeah, right.
Well, it hurts.
Yeah. Well, that changed. I'm glad. He learned how to do it.
He ended up breaking every record there is to break.
Yeah. A couple of others, and we could talk about this all day, but I know that Randy Savage, and Randy is somebody who was really special to me. I got to work with him quite a bit, and I don't know if there's anybody who sacrificed more in the ring and for the business than Randy. And I know that you had a really great relationship with him too. Yes.
One of the guys that I more than like. I really loved Randy.
Yeah.
I loved the character of Randy Savage. They ran against us. My course of action was to not mention them and not let any of our talent mention them. So when they decided to fold up, he called me and said, I'm going to throw in the towel, and I just want to tell you that you kicked my butt in the most gentlemanly fashion. I wish you'd have been on that AWS. And I said, well, Randy, why don't you come to work for me? You've knocked Lawler and Dundee for a year. The fans think that you were building up to an angle. Let's cash in on it. And he came to work, and the rest is history. They sold out everywhere. And then when Vince called him, you know, Randy Savage is the only wrestler that Vince called, and Vince's style would say, I need you tomorrow.
Right, yeah.
And Randy Savage said, well, if you can't allow me 2 weeks' notice, then I'm not interested in coming. I have a friendship with Jerry that I wouldn't break for any opportunity. And, you know, that speaks volumes about the character of a man, that he was willing to pass up going to the WWE to keep his word.
Yeah. And he's the only one who ever did that.
Only one.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, I miss him to this day. I had a home in Sanibel Island, and whenever I'd go down or come back, I'd go to there St. Pete Beach or Indian Rocks, one of those. I can't remember now. I'd go over and we'd sit up on his balcony that overlooked the ocean and laugh about things that happened. Every time he would want me to retell the story of him at Madison Square Garden. Vince thought he was going to try to kill him, and I ran down the hall and grabbed Randy and pushed him in the first room that was available. And little Richard was in there, and I know he wet his pants. he thought this guy is crazy. Yeah. So anyway, we'd have big laughs and conversations. And
why do you think it ended so badly with him in the WWE? And it never seemed as though it ever was fixed, and it wasn't.
Well, Randy believes that if you give your word, you
live by it.
You die keeping it.
Yeah.
And Vince had Randy moved to Stanford.
Yeah.
And he was going to put him on the creative team. And then Vince had second thoughts because Randy can be very volatile. And the character that he has on TV sometime will come out in his real life.
Yeah, he lived it.
Yeah. And so Vince changed his mind. And instead of telling Randy it didn't work out, and here's the money to leave, he kept telling him later. And Randy just went nuts at Madison Square Garden one night.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
That was the end of him up there.
Yeah. I mentioned it. I'm also a big fan of your son, Jeff, and we don't have a lot of time to cover him, but he was quite an athlete, and it could have been a basketball player if he didn't decide he just didn't want to do it anymore. But were you proud of him early on when he decided to get into the business and found success, or would you have preferred that he didn't get into the business?
Well, my father left when I was 3.
Yeah.
So my parenting was kind of on the fly. And I believed that you could give your children your opinion, but don't try to enforce or live your life through them.
Mm-hmm.
So, was I disappointed? Absolutely. Jeff only got to play his senior year because of my divorce from his mother, and she objected to him when he came to live with me, and so he was ruled ineligible, and so he only got to play his senior year. And the big schools were hesitant, and several of them told him, well, go to a small school. So he went to Aquinas Junior College and started as a freshman, and Vanderbilt came to a couple of his ball games, recruiters, and his coach. Jeff came to me one day and said, I'm through with basketball. The coaches know the guys are smoking weed on the bus to the trips, and they don't care about winning. They just are here. I want out, and I'm not going to play anymore. I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'd like to break in the wrestling business. I said, well, I think that you would be a lot better off getting your education in the event you don't make it in the wrestling business.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, I'll know pretty quick, and you'll know quicker if I'm going to make it.
Yeah.
And I can go back to school then, but I just want to take a year off. Well, he took a year off and never went back.
Yep. Rest is history.
Yeah.
And you guys were estranged for a while, and with the business, but everything's good now. I mean, it was 2015, I think, and how great is that relationship now?
Very
your son in your life.
Here's the thing. We don't spend a whole lot of time together because I put the condition, because the wrestling business is what caused the breach in our family.
Yeah.
And so I told him, don't ever ask me about the wrestling business or what I'm doing and I'll never ask you. Let's pretend that you work in a beer brewery and I work in a whiskey distillery.
Yeah.
And we don't know anything about the wrestling business. So we have stuck to that. Well, he's with the WWE now and traveling 7 days a week. There's very little for us to talk about.
That's right. That's his whole life now. But I'm glad when you do talk. I'm sure it's great. Jarrett, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I could have gone on for a few more hours. You have so many great stories to tell. I hope we can do it again sometime. And I hope we actually get to meet in person. That'd be great.
Yes, I do too, Sean. And I'm sorry I missed your illustrious career, but maybe who knows what tomorrow brings.
That's exactly right. We're still in the game.
Yeah.